Sorry. So good day. I want to thank you once again for joining us for our second session, for the second session of GAPS Reading Club. I am very excited about the book that we are discussing today. It's Vijay's Prasha, The Darker Nations. And even though the book is published almost 15 years ago, I think it's still equally relevant like it was when it was published. It is an amazing book that covers, when it comes to the scope, but also the depth of the issues that is covering. The main focus of the book is the whole project of the third world. So he, in a way, echoes Frantz Fanon when he talks about the third world not as a place geographically, but as a political project. And the book is organized in, I think, 3 different sections when he's following the evolution and unfortunately, eventually the death, or as he says, the assassination of the third world project. So what is amazing about this book is that he somehow very successfully manages to cover all the subtleties of this project. As he says, it's early pre-Second World War history, then the institutional forms that the project gets, the initial pitfalls, as he calls them, and contradictions that unfortunately will never be resolved. He also, apart from analyzing internal dynamics and internal contradictions, captures very well the involvement of the big powers in the direction that this project is heading, and eventually their responsibility for the assassination of the project. Also, what is very, very interesting from the very beginning of the birth of the third world, he is rightfully asking or calling for the also responsibility of the United Nations to handle and to articulate some of the certain agenda, and eventually the failure of the United Nations to respond adequately to the issues and the problems of the third world. So I would like to hear from you initially, your impressions about the book. What do you think that is lacking and what is missing from the book? Even though it's very comprehensive, for example, I don't want to be too biased, but what is very striking for me initially is a little bit of downplaying of the role of Yugoslavia and the role of Tito in the birth of a non-aligned movement, and also determining the agenda and articulating the agenda of the movement. But I want to hear now from you, what are your impressions? Who wants to start?
I started the last time. The other time. Over to you, Paul.
I thought I started last time. Oh, okay. Anyway, so
I missed that part.
I mean, I agree with Jelena. That's almost just about the only fault I can find in the book, really. And Vijay's not alone in this. When there was the 60th anniversary of Bandung, there were essays by Samir Amin, which did the same thing, really. It kind of saw the non-aligned movement as a weaker version of the Bandung spirit. But Vijay doesn't do that. I mean, this is a beautifully written book. I mean, I have to say that he's my friend, but it's like, it is beautifully written, and it's got the right balance between scholarly academic research and a kind of activist urgency, it seems to me. Vijay spoke via Zoom at a conference I helped to organize in Rijeka just over a month ago. And he made the point then, and this comes through in the book, that we never look back just for the sake of looking back. We look back because of what we can learn from history for contemporary struggles. And I just think that the book is so rich in that, really. So 3 things that I think it does really well, and then 1 thing that perhaps it doesn't do well enough, really. The first thing it does incredibly well, I think, is see that connection between Bandung, Belgrade, and Havana. That actually, you know, within 11 years, 3 very different events, the Bandung Afro-Asian Conference, the first summit of the non-aligned, and the Tricontinental, kind of, you know, set up in contradiction to one another because they're not the same at all. And what one of those highlights, the other maybe pays less attention to, and vice versa, but gets that connection brilliantly. The next thing he does, which, you know, is not easy to do, some of us have been struggling to do it badly for decades, is he gets the intersectionality of oppression right, it seems to me. He does not see class as the only or most pervasive or necessarily kind of dominant structure of oppression. He builds class, race, and gender very much in. What I would have asked him in Rijeka was, if you bring gender back in, what do we get really, in a sense? Because he does look at the Cairo Afro-Asian Women's Conference, and then the gender dimension, he's not quite as put forward as perhaps it could be, but he really does get the complexities of racialization, gendered oppression, and class brilliantly, I think. And the third thing that I love, and I think we talked about this even last time, is this. Okay, I was going to say, so let me phrase it like this: the complementarity but later contradiction between the attempt to link struggles from below, proletarian struggles, struggles of the oppressed, with the kind of creation of a new bourgeois modernizing elite, right? So I think Vijay, you know, that new book that I keep praising by Adam Gatachov, there is a clear, there is no necessary problem between state building and transnational counter-globalization, counter-hegemonic globalization. But what Vijay shows brilliantly in the book is how that accommodation to an elite, usually an old and a new elite together, is the thing that comes back to create the assassinations that Jelena mentioned, I think. So, you know, I think that issue of modernization, the role of nationalism, the role of neoliberalism, is just brilliantly done. And yeah, the only fault really for me is Yugoslavia. And it's not terrible. It's not like that you know, the significance of Briuni is underplayed. It's not. Or the significance of Belgrade is underplayed. It's not. But interestingly, when he spoke in Rijeka, and I think it comes through much more in his later work, he actually thinks the lasting relevance of the non-aligned movement was the articulation of a new international economic order, which never was realized, but still exists as a discursive document. And some of the work that Vijay's doing now is actually revisiting that as a template for a kind of way of thinking through some of the other things. I forgot to say, I mean, he does the oil crisis really well. He does those moments of failure incredibly well. But of course, it's not a Yugocentric text, but, you know, we have this explosion of literature now on socialist Yugoslavia and non-aligned movement. I'm contributing to it. So I actually don't mind the fact that he doesn't get Yugoslavia quite right. Just a beautifully written book. And I mean, I actually wrote down like 8 quotes just from the first 20 pages, you know, those one-liners. The third world was a place, it wasn't a place, it was a project. There's so much of that in there. And yet the scholarship that goes into making those one-liners is clearly deep and incredibly well done. So, you know, just as I hated the first book in this series, I love this one.
And I hope that you will love the third one. Feroz or either.
Oh, sorry. The genius of this book lies first of all, it articulates what the political project was about. So it was against colonialism. So I also made some notes. So it was first of all a contempt of colonialism in whatever form. It was a commitment to kind of non-racialism. And then the third thing, it was about stabilizing peace, and etc. What fascinated me here was the dynamic in the book, which comes out all the time, was he talks in one place of the politics of the economy and economics of politics. And the first one he says is who writes the rules. That's the political economy. That's the politics of the economy. And then the second one is economics of politics, is about who holds the economy, the economic muscle to actually write those rules. Paul is right. I mean, I'll say the dumping of the NIE. Oh, yes. But it's interesting, later on in the book, actually, the South Commission takes it up again. So there's something, how to say, and in Singapore, I thought it was look on you, etc. There's something in the air there. But what I'm afraid of is that if you look at what he talks about at the end, he says, another quote, the national liberation project had a tendency towards a naturalistic analysis of political rights, that if colonial power is removed, if the state is controlled by the national liberation forces, these forces will produce a decent economic model and will set people free. Now, the thing for me is the way this has been done. In South Africa, what has happened is that, and I'm talking about this, I will know more about this, I'm looking at the transition. And when Mbeki came back to South Africa, I just want to read from this other book. Oh, sorry, 1 second. When Mbeki came back to South Africa in 1990, he was shocked. It said the people did not have a culture. People actually did not have a cultural base. They were totally decimated, blah, blah, blah. And then he goes on to say that observing all the indicators, he called it a slave mentality. He says, Mbeki realized that we have to do something here about addressing recovery. And that came the African Renaissance. And it's mentioned in the NEPAD. But the African Renaissance is purely a World Bank strategy, which is got a World Bank strategy for Africa. And what had happened in 2002 at the Durban conference, is Mbeki was central in smashing the Third World Project. And saying that, listen, this is the way to go is IMF-led globalization, etc. And what is interesting about his move is that he thought that he could play the global mandarins better at their own game. That's what I'm talking about, the slave mentality earlier on. Now, but the issue is that it was the same game used, and the old kind of elite kept the power, kept the money, etc. And black people got the vote. And it's simple as that, because the problem is that there's been no accumulation, no redistribution, etc., etc. And that speaks to me of where the kind of third project has come to, even in the hands of people who might say that that they're championing whatever. So I have some other issues, but then maybe I'll stop there. But So, sorry, one last thing. The idea that simply if you take state power, and somehow if you change you change the positions and you rearrange the chairs, that you'll have a state that's functional. And in most instances, in every one of these cases, the state might have been functional to a particular project, but became highly dysfunctional after that, partly because they crushed dissent. And he's got a beautiful line in here where he says, the perennial problem of popular mobilization is when the organs of the people are stifled dissent in civil society in the name of national progress and democracy. So, so this is a kind of, how to say, he weaves this narrative, and I think it's a beautiful narrative. Thank you for this book, Elena. I mean, it really is a beautiful book. I think what it does, it's a tour de force, in the sense of where it ties together the different struggles in the world and it places them in the progress within a larger context, which I haven't seen before. You've read about these struggles, blah, 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 but I have never seen like the long line being drawn. And thank you for that. I'll stop there.
So let me be play devil's advocate here. So my starting point is very much your starting point, Yelena's, Paul's, Feroz's. I think the book is a tour de force, and I think it is so in a very particular way. It does something which I think was at the heart of the social history movement of the 1980s, the late 70s, 1980s, of wanting to give, in the language of that time, sort of agency back to ordinary people, and in this case, the struggles of ordinary people, and in this case, of the struggles of ordinary movements. So what he does is, I think what he shows is that the emergence of the third world in a way that had never been done before is a major historical moment of the organization of non-imperial political forces and non-imperials and non-imperial states, or states outside of the imperial center. And it's a story, it's telling that story, and that alone is an extraordinary achievement, I think. And as I think he does it beautifully, and I agree, he writes beautifully. The story is completely fascinating, it's completely compelling. And I think just telling that story alone is an incredibly important achievement. And having said all of that, there are two areas where I think the book falls short, and it falls short on conceptual and political grounds. And so I'm saying this from the perspective of deep appreciation, but also wanting to provide a more critical reading of the book. So I think he's underestimated the own importance, or the importance of the very phenomena he's writing, which is the emergence of the third world and of the non-aligned movement. Because the non-aligned movement is both a political movement, political development, but it's also conceptual development. It's associated with the conceptual development. It emerges in a space of an awkward, contested, uneven, ambiguous movement away both from sort of an imperial conception of colonialism and of capitalism's role, but equally a movement away, especially in the Yugoslav role or Yugoslav space, of traditional Soviet communism. So it's an attempt to think the third world as a space which is not exhausted by Western conceptions of the periphery or Western conceptions of the colony, but equally it's a space just trying to emerge to think of the third world outside of the categories which are emerging within the Soviet Union and within the socialist bloc, or in a tense conversation with them. So I think it's that second movement in the book which I think is at its weakest. So it's very clear that it's an anti-imperial project, but I think it's also equally an anti-Soviet project, or a project which emerges outside of the ordinary parameters of the Soviet Union. So what's interesting was and this is where I think conceptually the book falls short, or it falls into perhaps not a contradiction, but into at least an impasse, conceptual impasse. His conception of the relationship between imperialism and capitalism is a traditional Leninist one, as far as I can understand. So I don't think that reading is correct.
It actually speaks repeatedly about financial capitalism in this book. And I mean, and the thing is that he mentions and he says how it's busted project all the time. Number one. And number two is that I think, if one was to judge this book and assess this book according to, conceptual categories, etc., I think that, at the end of the day, he's saying that the struggles that people have every day, those are the ones that we need to build on. That's the pedagogy of change in the future.
Yes,
that's what he's saying. I mean, and I think that I think that's the more important lesson rather than conceptual flaws or the conceptual problems of the book. I mean, the thing is that it is a kind of, in a sense, like a kind of manifesto and calling you out to actually do something based on those struggles.
Let me push back against that, if you don't mind. I don't want this to be a conversation, but the everyday politics then becomes an everyday politics of nationalism. Now, so there's a moment in the book which I find very interesting. So he writes beautifully around how the post-colonial project descends into the one-party state project, and he's deeply critical of it. But I think he underestimates the degree to which very third world nationalism drove those states towards one-partyism. That one-partyism is not an aberration to the third world movement. It was something deeply embedded in the third world. Perhaps not as the only option, but certainly as a dominant tradition within the third world movement. So, I've written a little bit about this, but I think it's been fairly well established. One of the classic features of the post-colonial world, whether it's in Asia, whether it's in the Middle East, or whether it's across Africa, is the tendency towards one-party states. So to say that movement is somehow an aberration of the third world movement, or somehow outside of its core politics, I think is naive. So even though he writes beautifully about the kind of how the one-party state, in some senses, betrays that tradition, I think that he's not on strong grounds there. So and this goes back to your point, Feroz. his everyday politics, the everyday mobilization, in the end, is the mobilization around a third world nationalism. So that's where I think the dead end in South Africa is hit, because our mobilization, as we've hit the dead end of nationalism. And I think the dead end of the third world movement was not its socialism, wasn't its extraordinary international promises. It was its nationalism, which in the end it could not escape from. But anyway, that's
no, but I actually think that he acknowledges that he says that what unfortunately happened with assassination of the Third World Project is that reactionary forces like nationalistic and in all sorts of ways came to be dominant. So that is the problem, because the end of the Third World Project left a void. And what filled in that void? It's unfortunately that. So it's not like that he's arguing that that is the way to go. That is one of the side effects or like consequences of the end of the Third World Project.
But this is where you and I disagree right from the beginning. Our first date nearly didn't make it, because precisely on that this is a long-standing tension between us. But it seems to me it's not just that it leaves a space. What I'm suggesting, in what he's underestimated, is that kind of nationalism, which you're saying later occupies the space, is implicit in both in his own analysis of the third world and of his own politics.
But maybe because it was implicit into like anti-colonial struggle. So it's.
If I can mediate in this partner, I mean, because I think your provocation is deeply productive, Ivor, but I think you're in danger of conflating two tendencies that I think have a very different dynamic one to another. The first is that actually what you call traditional Soviet communism is actually the moment of Stalinism, right? So it's actually, so it is not that, so Tito's break with Stalin was not in any sense at all about a retreat from global communism, right? It was the idea that there should be many varieties of global communism and that they should not be determined by a Soviet model, nor should they in practice be based on Soviet neocolonialism, right?
Yes.
So that, of course, what you do have around this time, and I think, you know, Vijay doesn't really go into it because that's not the agent, you know, the Third International is not the agent that Vijay wants to put in the center of the book. The Third World is that. But clearly many nations in the global South, as they became independent, did have a close relationship both with communism and with Soviet communism, right? And there's that lovely book by Luka Stanek on architecture that, you know, Ghana had no problem in having Yugoslav and East German and Hungarian and Bulgarian architects working together because the model was of a kind of translated transnational communism, right? So that's the first point. And actually, if Tito could have got Euro-communists in Italy and France to support him, he probably would never have turned to the global South, actually, and the non-aligned movement. But that's a kind of what if of history, right? But that you're conflating that with the issue that Feroz beautifully talked about, which is it's not the one-party state that is the problem in the global South. It's what is the class composition of that one-party state, right? Yeah, I'll stop there because you're shaking your head. So, you know, in a sense, what the argument in the book is that the accommodation to the old comprador elites and the new bourgeoisie was so great that actually when they took over the state, they used that for a kind of complicated mixture of nationalism and later neoliberalism. Just a footnote, Feroz, I thought you were brilliant in terms of where I think the book is taking us is that neoliberalism is not just an economic project, it's a deeply cultural project in the global South as well. And I think that is something that is perhaps not is more implicit than explicit in the book, but it's a really important kind of argument.
So I just come in here for a moment. I mean, because there's a line in this book which blows the mind. I mean, speaks to I was told. It says, while nationalism is indeed a modern phenomenon, nationalists enliven their national demands with ancient stories of their nation, and therefore they saw their quest not as the production of a nation into a state, but as the reclaiming of a nation under a state. So I mean, I think that to kind of, so on the one hand, I think there's a kind of ambiguity about the party, and there's on the other hand, there's a kind of ambiguity about the kind of nation and that state and kind of how it came together. So I think it's recognized. But I just want to go back a little bit. What's fascinating is also is that elements of the new international economic order actually coming into play right now, with respect to how they've responded to the financial crisis and with respect to how they respond to COVID. I mean, they are unorthodox policies are now on the table. I mean, orthodoxy has become, heterodoxy has become orthodoxy. So I mean, I'm not speaking directly to your point, but I think that he makes a more subtle point. And at the end of the day, he's saying the third world must be taken by political struggle.
Yes,
that's what he's actually saying. That's in somewhere in the book. The third world must be taken by this political struggle. So he's not. He doesn't define what the third world is because of its ambiguous nature after the collapse. So I don't know. I'll stop there.
Yes, and also what is very interesting, especially looking from this perspective now, is how for a moment it seems like people who really trusted in the future of the Third World Project, like maybe they were a little bit naive, because the moment that one unifying factor was not a factor anymore, and that's colonialism, it seems that the whole project started crumbling a little bit, because the whole like Third World Project, the countries are so diverse. There are so many subtleties within and contradictions within them. So it seems like, unfortunately, the only things what was keeping that project together was the decolonization project. The moment that wasn't a topic anymore, it started slowly to fade. So he also says that by the end, and also coincided with the end of the Cold War. So by the time the Cold War ended and the African countries and the whole process of decolonization was over, it seems that the interest was unfortunately for reviving the project, that it completely disappeared. So, for example, if we look, Feroz now reminded me, like when it comes to COVID and how the countries from global South reacted. So Russia and China, that like if we talk about BRICS, were among the first to develop a vaccine, but still. So, for example, looking from South African perspective, who is also a part of that forum, South Africa never started using those vaccines. So even at that basic level, there's a huge suspicion among the bigger players within the global South. Not to mention, what about the rest of the continent? So it's even something urgent like the pandemic didn't bring them together, let alone the fight against or how to redefine the global economic order or to reform the United Nations, something that doesn't come across as that urgent. So what are the actually prospects for reviving the Third World Project? Well, putting a geographical perspective aside, whatever that third world is.
Sorry, just come in very briefly. I tried to kind of fast forward this book and look at contemporary social struggle. And if you read the works of the anarchist works, Stephen Newman, etc., they are saying that the contemporary struggles are actually leaderless revolutions, like Extinction Rebellion, for instance. Now, this suggests a new kind of social movement. It suggests a new kind of organization which goes beyond which goes beyond the talk of nationalism and might even go beyond the talk of the third world, because the third world is being constructed now with, for example, chapters of Extinction Rebellion all over cities all over the world. So, it's a different kind of, and I don't think it's going to, so, and that also comes with a kind of level of subordinated financialization and blah, blah, blah. But I'm saying, but I think that he leaves you with that question. If you were to fast forward.
Yes, so I think I just want to like suggest, so that is also the book that we planned for our third session. It's the book by William Robinson called The Crisis of Humanity. And that is exactly what he's talking about when it comes to how the face and the nature of capitalism changed dramatically. And what does that mean to the working class, to a global working class, to a creation new transnational capitalist class, and how to fight it? And what would be the issue that will mobilize solidarity across the globe?
So I mean, if you don't, I mean, so I think we have to take seriously, I mean, the limits of the Third World Project, not for the sake of it, but because it's associated with a phenomena of the post-war period, which actually requires explanation. And I don't think we can just take it for granted. So in terms of the normal historiography, we have a kind of conventional historiography of the nation, which goes, you know, the national idea is invented in the French Revolution, and then you have a period through the 19th century of the evolution of nation states, the breakup of empires, and into the 20th century. The 20th century therefore becomes this kind of the period of nations. Well, that historiography, that history is kind of deeply flawed in the sense that it massively underestimates that the period of the most accelerated development of nations is the period after the Second World War. And it's driven overwhelmingly by third worldism, or by the third world movements, by the splintering or breaking up of empires into nations. So this huge and ongoing emergence of nation states. And Paul, it speaks to something which you raised earlier, that you know, at the heart of the third world movement was a kind of internationalism, and a project of internationalism and solidarity on the basis of race, on the basis of oppression, as was the word that you used, the solidarities of oppression. But the very logic of the nation, of the nationalism, sorry, I keep going back to it, the splintering of empires on the basis of nations, what it did was, it appealed to an internationalism and a solidarity, but at the same time, in real politics, it broke up those solidarities or centered them around national elites and national interests. So you have this great tension of the post-war period, and I think the period which we're living now, is that you have a discourse of solidarity, but you have a practice of ever splintering national assertions going on. So, and you've seen it very strongly in South Africa, but I think you see it in Southern Africa very acutely. So this is for me the tension, and that's why that question of nationalism and its relation to the third world movement, I think we can't just step around it as if it's either a kind of it has a neutral relationship to the failure of the third world movement. I think there's something intrinsic in the third world movement, especially around its nationalism, that in the end privileges questions of race, and privileges questions of race over questions of solidarity on the basis of class, and makes it very difficult to imagine an international solidarity beyond a kind of multiracialism. So this is where I think the third world movement ends up, is a kind of a multiracialism of a kind of cosmopolitanism. I mean, look at Achille Mbembe's work. You know, what is the new cosmopolitan vision? It's kind of an Afropolitanism. You know, we're all kind of there's no solidarity based on the material interest at all.
So you've opened another Pandora's box. I mean, I can't.
I have another book. Sorry,
I mean, really, no.
One of my favorite books is this is the French version, Norbert Elias. You know, Norbert Elias has got this amazing sort of historical sociology of the relation between France, Germany, and the UK around the class structures. But the point he does make, which goes to the third world movement, and it's certainly one of the great failures of post-apartheid South Africa. His argument was that in their contests between bourgeoisie and aristocracies and all those settings, the bourgeoisie develops itself in Germany in particular, as having a culture of its own in relation to the aristocracy. Now, in South Africa, you see that emerging, that in the sense that the post-apartheid project, its values will be different to the apartheid project. What I find interesting about the Third World Movement is also that the Third Worldism represents a cultural movement, that its values are different to those of the West. It's not just a kind of mimicry of, it's not just a kind of wanting to equity within a.
But that, for example, unfortunately, all the recent attempts, like with BRICS, there's no attempt to redefine, to step outside, to provide an opposition. The BRICS is just a way to negotiate more favorable conditions for certain big powers from the global south, unfortunately.
Because that's what each of those big nations are anyway. So I can't remember who it was who said that the nation state is both far too small and far too big for a progressive politics, right? So we can argue that there isn't enough in the book about climate change and climate justice, right? There also isn't enough in the book about this new municipalism, you know, rebel cities and stuff. But I do think that perhaps what is important here is that between this kind of neoliberal globalization and nationalist projects was this assertion of new regionalism. I mean, I think I went on and on about it last time: Pan-Africanism, Pan-Arabism, Pan-Asian developments. And I think the book is actually very, very good about why Latin America, it has a different story, because its relationship to the political colonialism was different. And therefore its relationship to the United States and to Cuba as separate kind of potential centers for a new political economic order was also much more dramatic than in Asia or in Africa. So I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but I do think that, you know, the nation state is problematic anywhere, right? But it's deeply problematic in places where it was actually an accommodation to a comprado bourgeoisie, and where it became a kind of, you know, taking power. A footnote, ironically, if the book had paid more attention to Yugoslavia, then it would be that the dilemmas of Yugoslavia, once the revolution ran out of steam, once it became bureaucratic, once Gilas was purged, who was the voice for kind of continuous revolution in a sense, right? All you're left with then is modernizing, is rapid growth, rapid industrialization, bigger and bigger cities, and modernization of agriculture. And that needs a strong quasi-authoritarian state. So actually Yugoslavia, even though it did not emerge from what we might call colonialism, would have been an example of the way in which these things can go terribly badly wrong if you don't have a spirit of continuous renewal. And as Farouz was saying, I think the meta message of the book is that can only come from radical social movements, from periodic challenges to state power per se.
One of the things that I always, in this book, it says, I'm struggling with this nationalism, partly because I'm thinking more of the kind of external economic right-sizing of the state, political right-sizing of the state. The impetus is actually coming now from elsewhere by trade rules and blah, 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 blah. But if you look at the political program of this nationalism and what you might want to call it, in the book, it says there's three kind of things. First of all, disarmament, national sovereignty, economic integrity, and cultural diversity. Now, I would feel more comfortable kind of entering this debate by looking at those components of that nationalism. Because I think the nation state has been a construct within that. And it's been a construct, and in fact, an imposed construct. But I want to speak less about that. What is wrong with progressives is that every time when you speak of struggle, etc., then there must be international solidarity. There has to be a purpose. There has to be a way forward. I mean, this is, what age are we living in? You sound like old vanguard kind of communists here. So the party is actually disappearing itself.
No,
But then, I was sorry. There was a tangent footnote. I think there's other ways of actually going into this. You can come to nationalism at the end of it, but you also be conscious that this is being politically and economically externally written, the contours of the state.
So what I think actually what he does, so usually the studies, most of the scholarship on the third world focuses on the failure of liberation movements or some internal dynamic. He brings in that outside international dimension, international factor, and how actually the countries of the core assassinate, or they are much more responsible for the assassination of the project, using different kind of methods and different kind of strategies. And that already started slowly in the 70s. So maybe what he doesn't explore enough is that the role not only of financial institutions but of development aid that started much earlier to come into as a big game changer in especially.
It's called development management.
No, it's an absolutely key point you're making.
So
Absolutely
because what made a huge difference, it's from the very beginning, even though if you look and read the literature on the development, like development aid, what is stressed is that aid started to be conditioned strongly since the 70s, but aid was always conditions from the very beginning, from the 49 when when Truman gave his speech. The foreign developmental aid was always conditioned. So unfortunately, those new nations never had a chance of developing something like the autonomous and like economic plan and a strategy and the vision of future and the development, because it was strongly influenced by the development aid. Initially, it was the investing in the infrastructure, then after 10-15 years, it changed into human capital, then the 70s came. So it was never something that came as articulation of the internal assessment. It always was strongly influenced from outside. So
yeah, and I think that's brilliant. I think that really is the key point. And you can now, I'll try and find it and send it. I watched a documentary on Guinea Bissau, and you know, the orthodox narrative of Guinea Bissau is that Cabral had this wonderful vision, but it wasn't shared by the next generation leadership. They sold out. Absolutely not. It was that right from the start, the rebuilding of Guinea Bissau was so dependent on Western aid, right? And so just to finish this, in a sense, what one has now is, instead of the old Cold War where you had kind of US dominated conditionality, you had Soviet-dominated conditionality. You now have Chinese-dominated, I was going to say conditionality, a false anti-conditionality. You know, the joke that a Chinese minister agrees with a post-Soviet Asian state in 10 minutes to build 3 hospitals. You know, whereas it takes the West 5 years of environmental and social impact assessments. You know, that joke becomes serious now, that in a sense, developmentalism outside of great power neo-coloniality was never given a chance.
No, because you reminded me of something, because when you mentioned Guinea-Bissau, there is an amazing book. It's called The Tropical Gangsters. It is actually an autobiography of, he was a professor at Harvard. His main focus during his work was Latin America. And then he was hired by the IMF and sent to Guinea-Bissau to do the whole restructuring in the economic system. Why? Because he spoke Spanish. So he says that 3 weeks before he was sent to the country, he had to look at the map where the country is. He didn't know anything about the country. So he beautifully writes about all these the dynamics about it. But what is usually overlooked is that after the decolonization, the development was a substitute for civilization mission. So it was now the whole mission to develop. So they really never had a chance.
So I think you put it Jelen has put it beautifully. I mean, I think, and that is the focus of that book. And I think that there's I think that and I think this is where the traditional left is. It's on the focus on international constraints, on the possibilities of progressive politics in any local context, and the way in which international capitalism or imperialism fundamentally constrain the prospect of local politics. And I think that's, that frame is absolutely fundamental, and that's what I think the Vijay's book puts so beautifully back on the agenda. But I think we also have to complement that agenda with the sense of a local, and this is, I suppose, the social historian in me, that the way in which local movements interpret their international, interpret their circumstances itself has a history. They are drawing on concepts and practices both locally but from all over the place. So the way in which they are making sense of their predicament, the way in which they are making sense of their oppression is not some what spontaneous called, what Althusser would have called the spontaneous ideology of the philosopher. They're not reading off their ideology from objective circumstances. They are reading and interpreting. Mm-hmm. So we also have to, in our own work, I think we have to understand that constraining context of capitalism and imperialism. But we also have to pay attention to the histories of the concepts and the histories of the practices which inform the resistance. And that resistance is not so spontaneous. And we also have to accept that resistance makes lots of mistakes sometimes. So therefore, and I think that must be part of our analysis, that we're not always blaming, oh my goodness, it's the international circumstances. And I say that with the South African circumstances in mind. I mean, it's nearly 30 years of ANC rule. The truth is the constraints of international capitalism are there. We're an open market, but we're not dependent on aid. We've never been dependent on aid. We may have integrated ourselves into the international economy in ways which are prejudicial out of mistakes, but largely this is an economy with enormous amounts of domestic capital. The catastrophe of ANC rule is quite astonishing. I mean, we live in a city. Feroz lives in a bubble in Cape Town. Johannesburg is a
broken city.
Bubble with a swimming pool.
It's broken. Yeah, we also have a swimming pool. We also have a swimming pool, and I have to admit that our garden is about 1.5 acres. We have a little patch of So sorry.
But no one is. The problem with the debates, the kind of the post-colonial and materialist debates. I mean, this is breaks out in urban studies all the time.
Yeah,
is that the post-colonial splinters into many places.
It's
fragmented and splintered, and to even bring them together. And then the post-colonial people don't want to talk to the other people. It's two different kind of scholarships, and bringing them together then leads to a discourse which has emerged in South Africa, which have been used very opportunistically, which basically says, no, that Cape Town was not a neoliberal project, for example, because there were people within who were actually trying to push it differently. And hence you've got to look at the struggles within that and see how it went, etc. But the problem is that the net effect of that was that it just screwed poor people and excluded them from the city. But I got this one issue that, but I want to ask Jelena, is that, development has always had this modernist orientation. Perhaps the kind of crisis has been kind of what has been delivered, how it's been delivered, blah, 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 because it comes out a little bit in this book, is about the nature, Makandi, where he speaks about it as well, is that you reproduce the same monsters. So what was that project? And either that project was relayed via aid or via what you're calling development management. That's how it was packaged at one point. And then later on also through foreign FDI, et cetera. But again, I'm coming to this point of it's being externally kind of driven and externally conditioned and fashioned in very definite ways. And I think, Ivo, you're right. Maybe the nationalism and the internationalism was a way actually to say that this was the conditioning that we wanted to change and the why we wanted to change.
But the thing is, the thing with the development aid is not so straightforward how to resolve that. So I think that the most radical suggestion, and it caused a lot of discussion, came from Dambisa Moyo. So she wrote that book, Dead Aid, and basically she suggests that one of the reasons, so first of all, she compares the development aid to, for example, to Africa, to Marshall Plan, and how it's fundamentally different and why Marshall Plan worked and development aid is not working. So what she's suggesting and what she said it needs to be done, she said, what would have happened if all the African leaders one day receive a phone call in which it is said, your aid will end in 5 years' time, and that will be that. Because it's somehow the fact that it's continuous, that it's one of the reasons why they're not exploiting the existing resources. It completely changes and determines the dynamics in the economy, in the institutions, in the reforms, in the reforms in the different policies. So I think that I don't know how, there was a great hope that when the China appeared as a new player, that it will at least make that maneuvering space for African countries slightly bigger, but that didn't happen. And the prize was that, well, you know, they don't condition their aid. You don't have to remodel your economy or your political system to the Chinese one, but there is that other side of that medal that Paul was talking about. So I think that it is not so easy to solve that puzzle.
I mean, it's interesting because you do have, at the same time as this explosion of external aid, you do have this reworking of a kind of developmental planning tradition. You know, so the idea that we will set our own objectives.
Yeah,
I suppose it's a kind of complicated counterfactual, really. But for me, and again, the Yugoslav model is quite important because you have in Yugoslavia the most rapid modernization in history, or the most rapid industrialization in history, and the most rapid deindustrialization coinciding with war, right? So it might be the speed of this was part of the problem. You know, that I think that first generation of decolonial elites thought they only had a narrow window, and maybe, you know, seeing things in a longer term might have been better. That's why Kaunda becomes a kind of important figure in this, really, because Kaunda, as the kind of second generation of NAM African leaders, did have a different take on development.
Explain what you're saying. I think you're saying something important, but I'm not fully understanding. You're saying that if they hadn't pursued industrialization as vigorously or as rapidly as they had of.
Yeah, I mean, do you know what I mean? I think when you read a lot of the stuff from that early first decolonial moment, there is this sense we have to do rapid industrialization because then we'll have rapid growth, which will give us much more resources in order to kind of build a social structure.
So I think this is,
you know, I don't know. It's just as I say, it's a counterfactual in the sense.
No, I think you put your finger on something which I think is absolutely profound. We've spoken about it, but it's there's something about the temporality of the post-colonial moment, the time of the post-colonial moment. I mean, you see it in South Africa. You know, in the work of Jean-Francois Bayard and others, for example, that the politics of the belly. If you read it carefully, it's a politics of the present. It's of kind of immediate. It's a kind of politics of immediate gratification. It's an immediate consumption. It's an elite project which consumes for immediate gratification without any sense of the long-term planning. And you see it. I think it's very acutely visible in South Africa. That's why I brought up the Normadelia stuff around an elite project that is very much embedded in the here and now. That is not planning for the future. It's not a generational project in any ordinary sense. So I think that is.
But that's also to misread, I mean, state construction. I mean, you know, if it's not messy, if it's not complex, if it's not all over the show, then actually it's not happening at all. I mean, that's what Hilary McIntosh says, I mean, on writing on the state. But I might have to sign off. I'm sorry, I've got some people are doing work here. But there's some 2 points to make very quickly. Is that the one point is that in the Lords of Poverty, a nice book, they say they're solving poverty by driving on 4x4s and drinking pina coladas and drinking pina coladas and then talking about poverty. And that's what it was. Second thing is that a lot of that money actually that came in was going to special purpose vehicles, which was bypassing the state. So in other words, they were actually undermining institutional capacity and institutional building. And there's an argument. Is there an argument to suggest that aid did exactly that?
Exactly.
So, you know, So the thing is that how then that affects state construction?
No, exactly. There is a huge scholarship around where does that money go actually, and what does. So there was a study done said that, like, for example, for every dollar that the US gives in terms of foreign aid, because they are the biggest bilateral donor, I think something around 70 cents goes back to the states, because they have all sorts of regulation. For example, so it's and not to mention how they undermine the building of the institutions. But speaking of the vacuum specialization and all that, I just I want to make a footnote that wasn't a mistake made only within the new state, the nations. It's also the framing that was coming from outside, that those countries needs to catch up. You know, it's everything was put in place, so they need to catch up as fast as they can. So I think it was was coming from both sides.
No, and I think
Totally. And I mean, I have to go as well, but just another footnote. I think, Feroz, a really important thing here comes back to what you said right at the start. There was no peace dividend. There was no peace dividend for the global South, because India was at war with China almost from the moment that there was this evocation of a global South, you know, Ethiopia, Eritrea, so that actually an idea that we're actually not going to be at war, so we can actually divert funds, was never really there. And that's incredibly important, I think, as well. And Vijay gets this right as well, you know, countries were investing in nuclear programs. Yes. Quite early on, big countries. Yes. So you know, that if it had been this peaceful kind of coexistence model as a new political economic model, it might have been different. But we're doing it might haves, and we should.
Okay, can I add the last footnote? And given that in this this afternoon I've been the kind of reactionary, I've played the role of the reactionary agent provocateur. So in that spirit,
I thought I got called a traditional leftist.
I don't like politics in the
voice of. I've been so. One, of course, is the relationship to Israel. I mean, one of the things about the third world is it becomes dominated by Middle Eastern countries, by the project of Nehru. And I think that has a very particular relationship to the trajectory of the third world in relationship to Arab nationalism, Middle Eastern politics, and ultimately to Israel. I mean, Israel, don't forget, in 48 and the 1950s, positions itself unambiguously as part of the third world movement. It's identifying as third world movement. It's unambiguously positioning itself as a model of third world socialism, seeking to build all sorts of military and economic ties with the third world, and it's NASA that's positioned that ultimately excludes Israel. So that's the final footnote on, and I think it's got a lot to do with the positioning of our understanding of why third world politics is so invested in that particular conflict.
If I'm right, Feroz hasn't had his footnote yet.
No, I just want to say very quickly, the new state, and wrap your head around this, is the network of treasury and central bankers. And you know, I mean, and that's the new nation state. So get your head around that.
We're going to love the third book.
No, I mean,
you're going to love it.
So you're obliterated.
Let's do something in South Africa about that. Let's write. I wrote the history of the National Treasury. Let's do.
No, exactly. But I mean, you know, but the state all over is strengthening that unit as being the motive force of the state.
And because
Poland, Yelena, what you don't know is that Feroz and I, 20 years ago, I think, we were part of a little set of writing radical papers. We were an insurrection within the city of Cape Town, because we had kind of left insurrectory movement in Cape Town academia. Anyway.
Well, now it's just simply left.
And now you have swimming pool. And now you have swimming pools.
Now you're with the pool. On the party.
You're always welcome. I have to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was great fun.
Fun.
Ciao.
Ciao.